from Hazeltine National Golf Club. Welcome to ATC Office Hours.
Thanks for having me again, Micah. Good evening to you, and good morning here. We're having a bit of a snowstorm
Oh, oh
here
my!
in
We are not having a snowstorm. I planted some grass in a friend's lawn. I planted two different kinds of grass in a friend's lawn today,
Nice.
and they didn't quite have the soil prepared when I arrived there with the grass. So I did some midday in the tropical sun, uh, digging and weed removal and hoeing and planting, and worked up quite a sweat.
I'd
So,
imagine.
so yeah. So I asked you if you could join office hours today because you've been posting a few new blogs, and you don't blog nearly as much as you used to. Back, especially when you were at Northland, I recall that you blogged more frequently.
Yep.
And what I find when you post blog posts now, and it might be one a year, four a year,
Mhm.
five a year, something like that. It seems to be something that you've thought about quite a bit, something that you might have written a draft of and then edited, and then finally you're ready to publish it. And I'm so intrigued about the topic of what you're writing about
Yeah.
now. And I just wonder uh, if you can maybe say what prompted you to write about, I guess, playability and the way we manage putting greens, and the
Mhm.
way that we evaluate the quality of the surfaces.
Yep.
Could you just say a little bit about what
Sure.
this series is about?
Sure. Yeah. Your description of my blogging is quite accurate. I sometimes go back to the use the Northland blog that I wrote as a reference for things, and I go back and sometimes I'll just go down this rabbit hole of reading things that I wrote back then, and some of it I have this very clear memory of having written it, and then some of the things I read and I'm just like, oh man, I had no recollection of writing that particular post, but I'm always amazed at how prolific I was, and I'm not really sure why that is. I don't know if it was just a smaller club, and I felt like I had more time to do it. Our children were younger at that time, or we didn't have any, or we had one, and now we have three. And so I think that's a part of it too. And I think it's just changing the way that I work. I sort of, when I leave here in the evening, I shut it off, and I don't really do a lot of that kind of stuff at home anymore. And that was in large part, I did a lot of that writing at home after work, and I just don't do that anymore. So, anyway, on this topic, it's something you and I have discussed many times over the years in many different venues, live and in person and virtually. And I just have felt, and as you said, I've been kind of writing this series of posts or putting these ideas down for some time, probably more than a year. I think I've had this sort of document going. And, you know, I have, since the Ryder Cup in 2016, tried to strive for this. How do we present those types of conditions to our members on the most days possible during the course of the year? Um, One, I think, and I don't think this is I don't think this is a commentary from a membership a championship hosting membership that is odd. But our members would often say, "Boy, the course is really great for these events, but we would really like to kind of have a piece of that too and get to play in those kind of conditions on a regular basis." And it's easy as a person who manages turf to sort of scoff at that idea and say, "Well, um, you we obviously can't produce those kind of conditions all the time." But starting with the 2017 season, I started to think, well, what if we could? And or why can't we? And what will we need to do in order to do that? And so that sort of led this progression of thinking and changing the way that we're managing the surfaces to get to the point where we are trying to produce a Ryder Cup like surface for as many possible days during the course of the year as we can. Um, and I think we found some real success. And it's really, in 2020, it was a pandemic year, but we really found some great, saw some great things on our putting surfaces in 2020 as we finally started to sort of crystallize all these things and put them all together. And then in 2021, we really got to that point, and data has been a big part of it. And in confirming that what we're doing is getting the kind of results that we're hoping to get.
That's what the blog posts are showing. I wonder how many it's going to be. I I think it's three now, three posts in this series so far, and it was really
Yeah.
intriguing. The first one you posted, I thought, I'm like, did he? Well, you put a poll up. You put up two pictures, and you said, "Is this disruption?" And the the pictures were, one was a verticut green with clippings yet to be swept off or yet to
Right.
be mowed off,
Right.
and the other one was a, looked like it had maybe a solid tined with a light to medium top dressing over it,
Yep.
and then you said, okay, here's my first post. Was that the, you said here's the first post, and by the way,
Yep.
here's a quiz to accompany it, or
Yep.
a poll. And
Oh, yeah.
I thought, well, he's distracting everybody from reading his writing. What's going on with that? But then it turned out the answers to that were totally different than what I expected. But you had told me you anticipated that the answers would be kind of along the lines that
Yeah.
they came back as.
Yeah. I think what that poll, it's not like I was trying to manipulate the conversation, but I think what that poll highlighted is the idea that as superintendents, we have in our mind an idea of um, what practices are disrupted to the surface. So if we go in and verticut like that, and I will say that that picture was an obviously very egregious example of verticutting. And I had gone out and done that. That was a few years ago, maybe the August of 2018, if I recall. And I had some greens that had some decline in the summer, which is a part of this whole discussion as to why that I feel now that decline was coming. We were seeing that at that time, but I wanted to create a bit of a seed bed when we did our aerification in August. So that was the way that we did it. And yeah, a double verticut, and that picture is without a cleanup. So clearly, like, nobody's gonna putt on that kind of setup. But everybody will say that that's some kind of surface disruption. But
Let me
um,
let me bring
yeah,
up the blog. Is that in the second post? Did you put a
that
picture
was
of that?
in that picture was in the first post.
It was in the first post. Okay. Is that disruption? So the picture, because some people are going to be watching this and some people will be listening. So we'll show the picture for those watching it, and you can then
Yeah, give a descriptive. I mean,
you,
so it's
it's
you know
obvious. Yeah.
most people who are watching this would and just so, like, you talk about like an actor doing their own stunts, just so that everybody knows I use my own pictures. Here's
Yeah.
the knife. um,
Nice.
um, um, it's a very, like, disruptive example of verticutting, and right through the middle, kind of at a let's say an 11 o'clock to a 2 o'clock, or 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock type of angle, there's a darker spot that was kind of the spots I was aiming at to open up a little bit to get some seed, to get some seed into. And it may or may not have worked, but it was a perfect picture to say, is this a disruptive practice on your putting greens? If you did this to your greens, would your golfers feel like, oh, that's something that's we don't want to see? And I think the answer to that is obviously yes, and the poll bared that out. So
Yeah. So then So the poll was like 90 some percent, maybe said that that was disruption.
I believe that was, yep,
Or
I believe that was the number. I can look at it quickly.
actually, we look at the second photo, which
It was
is
86% of 270 votes said that that was disruption.
that first one with the verticut.
Yep, correct.
Okay. And then this next one, I thought you're showing that to me. That's totally disruption. It's there's visible holes on the green, and there is visible sand on the green. So
Yep.
to me, if there's visible sand, visible holes, it's disruption. But you had some intuition that some people would answer it's not, and tell me about
Well,
that.
yeah. So I mean, I think that this is sort of what we've gotten as turf managers. We've gotten used to doing this type of practice on a fairly regular basis. And for those who will be listening to this, I'll describe it. It is kind of as you, and you described it a little bit, Micah, but it's a surface of a green with a with small holes. I don't recall the size of the holes that we did on this particular instance. I think it was slightly larger than what would be considered a needle tine. And then it's a fairly large amount of sand. I would not call this a dusting. I would call this a medium kind of amount of sand. And, I think this is the type of thing that we do maybe with fairly regular, we do this fairly regularly as superintendents and kind of, just say this is part of what we need to do to create the surfaces that we have, and we don't think of it as a disruptive practice. But I and the point of kind of the blog posts is trying to change our thinking a little bit, as I've sort of done over the last couple of years, to look at this from a member or golfer standpoint and think, well, what is this? Is this as big a deal to? It's not a big deal to us. Is it a big deal to them? And I think the answer to that is yes. The poll that I put up with a very similar number of votes it was almost 50-50. 50 said yes, 50 said no. Now I have no idea what the breakdown is, and it would be interesting to call out some of the people who voted on that and see if, golfers or superintendents who said what, who answered how. But I think that's the sort of the crux. These two pictures are sort of the crux of the posts, in that, are we doing practices? Have we gotten to the point where we're doing these practices that we as superintendents think are no big deal, but golfers, as they get it time after time after time, are saying, wait a minute, that's a big deal. What you just did there is a big deal.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating. If anybody hasn't read these posts yet, you can find them on Chris's blog. At the address there is ct-turf.medium.com. That's where you can find these posts. They're on Chris's blog. They're the most recent posts. And I see we have some people joining us live from all over the world. If you want to ask any questions or some comments in the chat, I know if you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook or on LinkedIn, I think all of the messages that you send or the chat should show up here so Chris and I can see it. Can you see the chat messages, Chris, where we have people from
Yep.
Randy from Bulgaria, Ryan from Australia, a LinkedIn user saying greetings from Cambodia, and we've got Neville saying hello from Laos. So we've got people from that's three continents already. You're on a fourth, so that's wonderful. And I know a lot of people watching would be Turfgrass managers and would obviously be have some expertise and opinions about these. So we're happy to have a discussion about this if anybody wants to send a few questions our way. All right,
Yeah,
Jorge, regards from Spain.
I should say add another continent. I should say too. I guess Bulgaria is in Europe. I should say too. This is on bent grass in a northern North America climate where we have winter. So I can't I'm I can't speak to people who are managing ultra dwarf Bermuda grass. I would hope somebody would that is managing an ultra dwarf would this would allow them to think sort of critically about what they're doing. But I don't want to say that this is a prescriptive thing that's going to work for everybody. But hopefully, it will cause people to think. So
Yeah, it's and I think the way that it's leading is we're kind of bouncing around here because I've read all the blog posts. So I also want to talk about where this might be leading, but
yeah,
I also want to review some of the things that you've talked about in the blog posts. Um, and I think by by keeping track of the work that's done and then also by measuring what the results are, which you've gotten to some of the data in your most recent post, I think it provides a framework that works for any grass to
mhm,
find out which practices are really necessary and what
yeah,
effect they're having. So we'll talk about some of that, some of the tools that you're making use of, and I think the post you put up yesterday, my time, no, or maybe early morning my time, yesterday your
yep,
time.
that would be right. I did it
Um,
right before I left work yesterday.
that was cool to see. Okay, that I see a question or a comment from Eric Johnson. He says, in my mind, timing of these practices would ideally occur during optimal GP. By that, he means temperature based growth potential, which Dr. Larry Stoll and I talked about last week on another office hours. He said that timing would be during optimal GP for shorter recovery time. Downside is that optimal GP is the peak golf
Yeah,
season. That's the rub. Exactly.
yeah,
So, yeah, I've talked with you about I've talked about this with you, Chris, where I used to go do consulting in Japan when I'd recently finished my PhD. I'd been a golf course superintendent before, and then I went back to grad school and studied and got a PhD. And then I started the Asian Turfgrass Center, and some companies hired me to provide advice. And I was providing advice about the amount of coring, core aerification, and top dressing to do. And I gave this advice about just do it during the times when the grass can recover. And it's easy to say to just
yeah,
do that, but so many people were saying they can't there are certain times in the year where they're not able to disrupt the greens. And I've paid attention. I've tried to pay attention to what my advice has been. And I've tried to pay attention to how the grass has performed year after year. And I've tried to pay attention to the work that people have done. And as I've done that, I've changed what my advice has been because people were not following my advice, still getting good results. And specifically with putting less sand, doing less disruption than I had been recommending. And
mhm,
so Eric is exactly right with his comment that ideally when you're doing the disruption, you do it when the grass can recover. But an even uh, an even more fundamental or an even more basic question is how much of these disruptive practices and disturbance of the surface is required. And
yep,
and that's kind of I think where you're going with this because you're measuring what the surface performance has been.
yep, yep. Yeah, without spoiling future blog posts, um, um, there is. I think that's the idea. You want to do these things when the grass is growing best. I had a discussion with a member last year after a particularly frustrating August aerification, and we do aerify at the beginning of August exactly for the reason that Eric mentioned, in that we're looking to do it when we can recover the quickest. And that was we've done that ever since I've been here, and that took all sorts of different kinds of verification into mind. And what we do now is generally very much sort of non-disruptive. Now we had a little bit of difficulty with that this summer, but But my point to this member was, I think this is the right time to do it, because if we moved any kind of a practice to October, essentially the grass is almost not growing in Minnesota at that time, and now you're not going to heal, so you're going to go into winter not healed. There's all sorts of reasons that a turf manager is going to understand. But if we're going to do our big aerification in August, I think what we need to then concentrate on, and again, this is part of the whole thinking of this, the way that I've started to manage our turf is, again, what you just said, how many times are we doing something to the grass? If I can say we're going to do it at August, at the beginning of August, and for 2 weeks the greens are not going to be ideal, but at the end of those 2 weeks they're going to be great. I think a lot of people can they can deal with that. They can say, okay, maybe I'll schedule a golf trip, a family vacation. And I'm thinking about the way that our members think about golf. A golf trip, a family vacation. In Minnesota in August, it's been traditional that a lot of people take family vacations in August because summer sports sort of end at the end of July. There's a break before school starts, and then people have a lot of time to go and take these vacations. So we do it then. People can plan for it, go do other things. And then, but if you're doing things that we consider as superintendents so light, frequent top dressing and needle tining in between, and you're doing that all throughout the season, it's hard for people to plan for. And we might think that it's not disrupting the surface, but I can almost assure you, when a golfer comes out and sees that something like that has been done, even if it's barely perceptible, that they're in their mind, they're thinking, oh, this is not ideal. I'm not playing on a green, and in our, in the way that we think about it, I'm not playing on a green that would have hosted a Ryder Cup.
And isn't that what the second post was about? So the first post was, is that disruption?
Right.
And then the second post was, are they right? Can I bring that one up and we'll have a look at that?
Yep.
And I love the way that you started this. Just when they were getting good, he ruined them again. And that's something that I think everybody's heard. And you described how you changed as a rookie superintendent, or even from when you were just working on golf course maintenance staffs and as an assistant, to where you are now. Can you describe that journey a little bit?
Right. So I mean, when I was on the crew and I was getting going in golf, I thought that these things were really cool because it was a disruption. It's a disruption from the normal day-to-day activity that we were doing on the golf course. So, if every day was setting up the course and mowing various areas, all of a sudden you're pulling out these machines that are kind of stored in the back corner of the shop, and you're pulling these cores, and this dirt is coming up onto the green. And it's just, really, in that sense, when you're just starting to do this, it's really cool. It's a cool process. And to take this putting surface that performs so well, and you pull these cores out and you dump this soil all over the top of the green, and you just, you're sort of like, wow, this is some part of like making these surfaces ideal. And so that was the way that I thought about these types of practices as I came into being a superintendent. And then when you become a superintendent, now the burden of expectation, you bear that responsibility every day. And so I see John Dempsey here in the chat says, as a former superintendent in a private club, there's huge pressure, re the timing for carrying out any disturbance procedures. And I totally agree. As a superintendent, you get to the point where now it's not just these are fun and cool and different types of practices to do, but now it's something that you have to bear the responsibility of healing from them, of how quickly that happens, of how long the course is out of play, and suddenly they're not so cool anymore. So, but at the same time, you think, you're pretty sure, because you've grown up learning this, school taught you and your work experiences taught you, that these things are necessary. So you're going to defend the need to do these things, because you're concerned that if you don't do them, you're going to have some negative impact. The course is going is going to decline, and you're not going to see the course playing the way that it should. So, a member comes and says, hey, just when they're getting good, he ruined them. And yeah, we've all heard that before. And then, I have myself made the comment, well, we're just making them better for tomorrow. And if we don't do this, you're not going to get the product you like consistently over the course of the whole season. But if you think about that, and if we're doing other things in between, if we're doing some kind of light verticutting or light frequent top dressing or needle tining, all of these things that we think as superintendents or turf managers are no big deal, the golfers, I can assure you, they think that's a big deal. They're seeing that happening. And if you say, well, we got to do this big aerification in name your time after Labor Day or beginning of August, because otherwise, of course, we're just making it better for tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes and there's sand on the green again, and there's holes in the green again, and there's verticutting lines on the green again. Imagine how a golfer feels when you tell them that. You tell them it's better for tomorrow, and then tomorrow comes and you've got something else on the green. So that's sort of that was the point of the second post. And so I tell a story later on towards the bottom of this post. And my revelation in this whole thing was a green committee meeting wrap up at the end of a season. And I was trying to remember the year that this was. I think it was after the Ryder Cup, but I don't recall for sure. And this member on the green committee said, well, everybody was happy. The year had been a good year. The course had been great. And he says, well, I just don't think the greens are that consistent. And I'm thinking, what is he talking about? Not consistent. And as we work through it, he comes to explain they're not consistent because of the sand. And his story was, or his example that he gave is, I'll play on a Friday and I'll play on a Saturday and the greens are spectacular. Awesome. Perfect. And then I'll have guests come in next week. And I know that I'm having these guests come in, and I will call them. I will text them. I will tell them, oh my God, you can't believe how great the greens were. Just wait till you play on these things. And then on Monday, without telling us or without notice, because it's, sort of a regularly scheduled practice, you would top dress. And then my guests would come on Tuesday or Wednesday, and the greens were nowhere near what they were on Friday or Saturday. And I'm disappointed. And he used the E word, embarrassed. Let me tell you, as a superintendent, if your members start to say something is embarrassing on the golf course, you better get it fixed pretty quick, because that's not a word you want. I think we can all agree that's not a word you want to hear coming out of a member's mouth. But the point was, he was, as I thought about it, as I took the time to really think that through, I thought he's right. I understand why that would be the case, because when we do put down top dressing, even light top dressing, there's a couple things that we're doing, a couple different options. And I know people do it different ways. Either we don't mow for a couple days, or we go out and we mow right away, which to me has always seemed crazy, because you're just picking up the sand that you laid down. But even if you mow right away, you're not getting a good cut. Your mowers are not going to be sharp. That sand is running through there, and you're going to be cutting greens with dull blades, which does not result in a good quality surface. So there is some impact to the surface. I wish that the data that I had, that I showed in the third post, I wish I had that from when we were doing a light frequent top dressing program here. I don't, unfortunately, but I guarantee it would show some drop in quality in the days after that event, building back up.
You would have these little waves.
Yeah.
You probably wouldn't dip. We're going to show those charts in a little bit, but if you haven't seen that post before, where in 2021, there are three big, it starts off relatively low, and then there's two dips during the season where the trueness of the ball roll, the smoothness of the ball roll really deteriorated because of essential maintenance. But you don't have data from when you used to manage it with more frequent top dressing. Were you when you did light top dressing, was that weekly, bi-weekly? How many times a year would it have been?
We ever did it weekly. I went from bi-weekly when I started, and we would do it every other Sunday night. We'd do dry sand into a dry canopy on a Sunday evening and try to get, the sand to be have as little impact as possible. And that is the way that we were doing it when this conversation with the green committee member took place. We were doing on a Sunday evening dry sand into a dry canopy, maybe even with a little bit of water on a Sunday, all the things that you would imagine doing. Then we'd not mow on Monday because we'd have an outside event or a member day off. But then, by Tuesday, Wednesday, when he's talking about bringing these guests out, the sand was still impacting play. And I can see how that would be the case, especially if you're playing in the morning. There's a little bit of moisture. Your ball gets a little bit of dew and collects the sand as it rolls along. I can totally see that. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I'm imagining what that chart would be. I think it would be pretty good by week 2, but you'd have these little dips. It would be a bunch of waves in terms of quality through the year. We've got a couple more questions in the chat.
Yep, I see those, and I think they're interesting. Let's go bring up John Emerson.
John Emerson asks, I'll let you read it, Chris.
So if invasive cultivation is needed, how much of these issues fall on the golfer to be more amenable?
Or I think he means flexible.
Flexible,
maybe.
Understand, I guess, would be the
yeah.
I think that's sort of, I guess, the point that I'm trying to make is I think that as turf managers, and I certainly have been there, we think that they should just say, oh yeah, I understand you have to do this. So it's cool if you have to do something disruptive to the surface and it's not as, but I don't think that's cool. If I was a member, I wouldn't think that. I would want to play. I get it. I mean, I've talked about this before, and I don't know if everybody has heard it or recalls it, but Hazeltine has hosted numerous. I've talked about the Ryder Cup, but many championships. And when I came here, and even after I was here, I always heard a course is great for the championships, and it's just okay in the in between. And yeah, that's not something I wanted to hear or wanted to be. That's not something I want on my record. We have 220 plus single-digit handicaps amongst our membership. So everybody that comes out, every single day that they come, they're expecting a great product. And I think, to John's point and his question, it would be great if everybody just said, oh, these practices, yeah, we understand and we're going to be okay if it's not, but I understand why they're not. If I paid money to join a club and I expected to play golf and I expected golf to be consistent almost every day that I played, it would make me upset if this kind of thing was happening. So I think the point, and maybe, okay, so bring Eric's question up.
Okay.
Micah, this is, I think, leading. I think I can transition with Eric's question.
Nice. So yeah.
So Eric Johnson says it does raise the question of why am I doing this, which data collection may or may not support our decisions to disturb surfaces. Chris, what is your threshold or trigger to disturb surfaces? So, okay, well, let me comment on the first part of that, because I think the idea of why am I doing this is something we should all ask ourselves. And if there is a good reason to do what we're doing, whatever that practice is, then great. Then I think that you can explain that to your golfers. You can understand that that is necessary to get the results that you want to get. But my point is we should really know we should know the reasons why we're doing that. So if you're going to go out and regularly perform a light verticutting every other week or whatever that time frame might be, there needs to be some kind of data that is going to tell me I need to do this. So then that's, what Eric says, what's your threshold or trigger to disturb surfaces? So I can't say that I have any, and maybe that's just not enough time with the data that I'm going to talk about. But I think that everybody should have some sort of threshold. So if you're talking about a regular verticutting or a regular top dressing, you should see that your surface quality indicators, in our case, it would be the stimp meter, the green speed, and the smoothness, the STR smoothness rating, which we'll refer to as the bobble test, that they're dipping somehow, that we're not able to get into the ranges that we want to get into. And then I might look at it and say, okay, there is a practice that I can now do that will reset us back to where we need to get to. But I'm going to hypothesize that that won't happen. I think on our greens, this is our greens. I think that the more we just go out and maintain and roll and cut, that we're going to keep those standards up at a high level without them dipping. They're not going to dip for need of some cultural practice. That would be my hypothesis. Um,
Although, but last, yeah, it's some of these things we don't really know
right.
because it's clearly there's some amount of sand needed, and maybe verticutting with the way that you're managing the greens, maybe verticutting is almost never needed, maybe
Yep.
brushing rarely needed,
Yep.
maybe you don't need to punch holes, but definitely some amount of sand seems to be necessary to smooth and firm the surface.
Yeah. I think that's true, and I don't want this discussion to make anybody think, whether you're a golfer or you're a superintendent, that I'm trying to say you shouldn't do any of these things. But I think we should really. I think that the crux of what I'm trying to say is you should have a way to know for sure if you need to do them, and that involves all kinds of data. My third post was just simply on stimp meter and smoothness data, and
Uh,
eventually I'm going to get to some of the other more long-term data, because of course you want to make sure that you're not doing anything, um,
just
any undue harm.
on the topic of things to measure, I'm reminded of a conversation we had the week before the Ryder Cup in 2016,
Yeah.
and it was about clipping volume. It's not so much about clipping volume. It's what were you trying to achieve? How fast did you want the grass to be growing? How much did you want the grass to be growing?
Yeah.
And we went to one of the greens on the eastern side of the golf course. I don't remember which one, and I was out there doing some task, and you came up and you said, "Hey, Mike, this is kind of what I'm looking for." And we got down on the green, and you showed me just like
Hmm.
what you wanted the canopy to look like, and I was asking about don't you want to check that by having it grow at a certain rate?
Yep.
And you thought that was interesting, but you were describing to me something that I thought was not transferable. Like you
Yep.
knew what you were trying to achieve and
Yep.
you accomplished it and you could communicate that to your team because you are working together on a daily basis. But if you tried to describe that to somebody in California, let alone
Yep.
somebody in Hawaii or in Bangladesh, it's
Right.
very difficult to describe what you were trying to make those greens play like and
Yep.
how you wanted that grass to look and how the leaves should be on each plant.
Mhm.
I think with something like clipping volume, it's a little bit easier to transfer that type of um,
Yeah.
result.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, when the discussion comes, it's interesting. This just reminded me of you know, golfers. We all know this, and I mean no offense to any golfer, but golfers will present you with ideas, and it is their intent is to help you and to try to make the course better. That's what they want ultimately. They want to play on the best course possible, and if they feel like they have a piece of information or they've gained a piece of information somewhere along the line, they're going to offer it to you, not because they think you're not doing your job, but because they think it can help make the course better. And I just was reminded of this as I was thinking about what Micah said. The same member who gave me the revelation with the sand on the greens came to me a couple of years before that, saying that he had been at a course, um, that had the same kind of grass as we have, and that he asked them what they do to maintain their greens so nicely, and he said, well, they told me they verticut them every week. And he came back sort of offering me that piece of information. That's not to say I know he doesn't understand what that may or may not do for the grass, but he's offering information that he thinks is helpful. So, um, I think the point I'm trying to make is when you get that sort of feedback on any type of item that you're doing on the course, um, remember that that's all they want. They want the course to be as good as possible. They're not trying to tell you right or wrong. But as Micah said, when you measure these things, when you are measuring and you're keeping this data, it does give you something that you can speak to. I had a conversation last year with a member, and I sent him one of the charts that's in my third post here, and he was just blown away, and he thought it was just really cool to see information about the course in that way. And of course, right away he asked me, well, can we have more days where the smoothness is at this level? And I said, yes, I think we can, and that's ultimately going to be the goal. um, but of course on the back end we're doing testing, and Mike and I had a 2.5 hour discussion about this, I think back in November, about the OM246. So we don't need to get into that, but that's a longer term sort of measurement testing that's being done to make sure that all of these decisions, and a decision to back off, a decision to change the frequency of a certain practice, is not doing some kind of undue harm, because of course we want to make sure that that's the case as well.
Should we look at some of the data from the third post? So you started off by asking. Is this disruption, or what is a disrupted surface like? And then you explained in the second post how you, over the course of your career, you've kind of changed from thinking about what might be minimal disruption for the grass could still be quite significant, and even to the level of embarrassing disruption from the perspective of a member, which
Right.
they're kind of right in that, and you understood how they could reasonably take that view of it. And then you as you think about what the members want, you realize that they want to play on the best surfaces possible, especially at a club like Hazeltine.
Right.
And then you wonder how you can do that, and you've started measuring it. And I'll bring up that third post now, which starts looking at some of the data. And you're using data as a singular, so you're doing the data says. I would sometimes use it as a plural. So I might use different, slightly different terminology. I'm not deciding. I'm just saying if we talk differently.
Well, it's funny you say that, because when I write about things like data, I do often think to myself, is Micah going to find this to be the correct terminology? So it's it's not that you're I don't find that to be offensive. I'm trying to get it right, because I know that you are going to know the. I heard a great story. This is you two were playing in some small club in New York, and they were gonna cover a song, a well-known song, and I don't know, I don't remember what the song was, but Bono and the Edge being the guitarist for you two, were talking about this before they were talking about this cover song they were going to play beforehand, and Bono said to the Edge, are you going to get the chords? Do you know the chords right, and do you have them all? Are you sure you're confident? Because Lenny Kravitz is going to be here tonight, and you can damn well be sure he's going to have the chords, or he's going to know which chords are right. So I think the point of that is that when I write these, Micah, I think about, am I getting this terminology right? Because I damn well know that you're gonna know whether it's right or wrong. So,
well, yeah. So I would say I would have written it as the data say, because data is
okay.
plural and
Okay.
datum is singular.
Okay.
But in common, at least in American usage, in the past 10 or 20 years, you're doing it in the way that normal people use data. But I just habitually refer to it as a plural, because it's multiple pieces of data. So, but please don't change, because you will be the one that looks strange if you start.
If I start doing it that way, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I appreciate all the questions in the chat. If there are other ones that come up, feel free to ask, and uh, we'll dive into this third post now about what the data say. Oh, John says that he's reminded of me when using data and spelling phosphorus. Yeah, thank you for spelling phosphorus correctly. That's certainly a pet peeve of mine. When people spell phosphorus as PHOSPHOURS or OROUS, that's quite incorrect, and it means something like phosphorescent or glowing. And Americans tend to think that that's the British spelling, so it maybe it's fancier and still okay, but it's just never correct to spell phosphorus wrong. And I think it's particularly an egregious error when soil testing laboratories show that on their soil test reports. And it's also a particularly a poor error for people selling phosphorus fertilizer products to make. So people that are involved in providing information about how much phosphorus is in the soil, or people involved in selling phosphorus, I think they should spell the element properly. Thanks for
Seems
that
like a
comment, John.
seems like a good backup plan.
All right. So, yeah, so jump into the data because this is really about, it's not so much this series of blog posts, which again, I can't recommend it highly enough that people read these because you've explained it so well, but it's not really so much about the health of the grass. It's about playability and about what work we do might inadvertently be changing playability, and we don't recognize it.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion too, and might be its own complete podcast, or maybe this is the one for it. We didn't really set a time limit on this, but um, um, I know that a number of years ago you started to see there were some people, and I think Micah, you were one of those people I would pay attention to who would say something along the lines of, "Well, I'm not really worried about the roots. I'm more concerned about what's happening on top and making a good playing surface." And I think when I first heard that I was probably at Northland, where I thought that a large part of what I wanted to do was to focus on having the strongest plant, which meant the best roots, um, the deepest roots, that kind of thing. And I remember initially thinking, well, that doesn't seem like the right thing. It seems like if you had really strong root system, then that would equate to a really good surface. But it might, but I'm not sure that it definitely means that you're going to have that. I think the way that we maintain surfaces is the two are not necessarily well linked to each other, I guess. The things that need to be done to create sort of good under the soil results on your plants are probably things that are going to not result in the best surface on top. And that's
Yeah,
where and
definitely.
we do that forgetting that what our golfers really are playing on is the surface on top. And should they just accept that we have to do things that disrupts their enjoyment of the surface in order to create a stronger plant? um, I suppose that we as superintendents think that they should, because we think that a stronger plant is necessary. But I'm not sure that you are sacrificing the strength of the plant if you just concentrate on the surface. And actually, one of my posts I think is gonna touch on that, because that's something I've seen as we reduce the frequency of our top dressing, is that the health of the plant is way better than it was when we were putting top dressing down on some kind of regular basis. So
Yeah, I've seen in warm season turf in Thailand. I just finished a survey of 30 golf courses. I did this with Brad Revel. So I think he and I went to a couple together. He did 7 courses or something, and I did 20 or something like that. So I've been around to see a lot of golf courses in Thailand over the past couple of months, and I do notice around the perimeters there's wear, and I just wonder how much of that is due to rolling and mowing and turning mowers when there's sand on the surface,
Yep.
which
Well,
yeah
I think
is
as rolling became um, a key component to turf management, um, there was Nikolai did all this work at Michigan State where you could roll and roll and roll, and essentially you weren't impacting the surfaces at all. But then, sort of from the field, the superintendent world was saying, "Oh my gosh, like if I roll, and I'm rolling all the time, I'm just wearing out the edges of our greens." And I was seeing that too. There's no doubt about it that we were, with consistent rolling or constant rolling, we were wearing out the edges of the surfaces. And so I even got to the point where I was rolling less, mowing more, rolling less, which is the exact opposite of that sort of seminal work that Nikolai was doing. Did I use that word correctly, Mike? Seminal.
I think so. I think
Okay.
so. That's like the foundational
Yeah. I think
fluid or the foundational information.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to rolling, I think that his work was foundational. So I was sort of turning that around, trying not to wear out these edges of the greens um, by all this rolling. But what I've found since I've started collecting more and more data is this: our surfaces just are not as good when we don't roll. They're not. And what I've also noticed, and I've noticed these things sort of by accident, not is that when we go a whole season without sand on the surface and we just roll and roll and roll every single day, the surface quality is excellent, the speed is excellent, the smoothness, everything is excellent, and so is the health of the grass. In the last 2 years, with just having just 2 top dressing events during the year, a May top dressing event and an August top dressing event, both of which are planned, both of which the members know is coming, so that there's a period of time in which we can just let the grass grow up through the sand and we don't have to produce some great condition for them. They can plan around it. We can plan around it. That's how we do our 2 top dressing events. When that is the only top dressing that's applied, we can roll every single day and we see absolutely no impact on the edges of the greens. 2019 was the last time I applied sand during the middle of the season, and it was Micah, you were here for the women's KPMG that year, and we had done some top dressing. The greens were not as smooth coming out of winter as we wanted. We didn't have really good grass growth almost until that exact week of the event, and the greens were not to satisfaction from a smoothness standpoint. So we did apply some top dressing before the event. Then we rolled and we double cut and we did a bunch of work. And then a few weeks later, despite having put this sand down before the event, I decided, because it was our kind of 1 month trigger event, that we were going to top dress. We did. It was July. It was hot. We got some skidding with the roller right after we did that top dressing, and that turf on the edges just declined and went downhill, and we lost it for the summer and had to wait for the cooler weather in the fall to have it come back. We haven't seen any of that since we stopped doing these in-season top dressings. We can just go out and just do whatever we need to do to maintain the surface quality, rolling and mowing, I guess I should say, not whatever.
Yeah. It goes back to Eric's question of, or Eric's comment about asking the question, why am I doing this? And
Right.
as we look at your data, I'll bring this up and we can look at some of these data. The most recent post, the one that went out yesterday, shows actually what you've measured, and I think, I mean, it doesn't surprise me now. I'm the one that made the charts, so I kind of saw how it was progressing through the year, and we've talked about this. We kind of know how it would be, but if I would have looked at this 5 years ago, I would have been shocked, or I wouldn't have expected it to be like this. 10 years ago, I would have said it's impossible. and I guess I don't know. This is it's really interesting because there are huge implications for what these results show. And if we, yeah, so why don't you describe this post?
Yeah. So what I wanted to do is, the first two posts were sort of determining like what do we think about what we're doing on the surface, what do our members or our golfers think about what we're doing on the surface, and then sort of coming to the data that we've been taking, green speed for much longer than the bobble test, but and showing what's actually happening when we maintain the greens like this. Are we, you know, what is it that leads to quality of surface? Um,
And
and I think as we scroll through these,
so the first one you showed was sort of, I think what you kind of defined as the goal, which was a bobble test of 8 or above, and the like the minimum goal would be a stimp meter average across all the greens of 11 and a bobble test of 8 or above.
yep. So and that again, this is kind of the first year with this data paired together. I've taken stimp meter every day for a number of years, and I have a lot of information on that. But this year, after reading some information that both Micah and Jason Haynes had put out, I added this STRI smoothness rating or bobble test, which is simply watching the ball roll across the green as it goes down off the stim meter and rating what happened. Does it snake? Does it does it does it chatter? Does it have any big um, disturbances in its roll? And then you give it a rating. It sounds complicated, but as you do it more and more, you really it comes quite naturally to do it.
And
Actually, the hardest part about it was for me when I first started doing this was to remember to watch it roll as opposed to just sort of rolling it and getting ready to roll the next ball.
yeah, I've been doing this for about 18 months now. When I take data on golf course putting greens and I just record this as I'm doing the stimp meter rolls. And a bobble is when the ball leaves the surface. So the first thing you're looking at is does the ball bounce enough during this roll? Not the initial hop, not the initial bump bounce that when it comes off the stimp meter, but once it finishes that initial bounce and then it's rolling across the green, does it leave the surface? If it does, there's bobble. So you evaluate how much bobble there is.
Yep.
If if there's any bobble, it has to be a 6 or below. So it's never gonna be 7, never gonna be 8 if the ball leaves the surface. So that's easy. And then you look for chatter. Chatter is vertical deviation from instead of just rolling, the ball seems to be moving up and down, but it's not actually leaving the surface. That's chatter. And then snaking is when the ball moves laterally, left or right, deviating from a true roll. And there's various gradations on a decimal scale from 1 to 10 in which you rate the bobble test. And it's exactly what the golfers are looking at actually. And
Yep.
so it turns out to be quite simple. Now, Lee Strutt had a couple of questions or comments on Twitter today, or maybe today in Thailand time, asking about the perimeter. And I've got a video that I've done and a blog post where I've explained 5 different ways of measuring smoothness and trueness. And the perimeter is one that's something that takes an iPhone into a custom built
It's almost
rolling
like a
frame,
roller skate. It looks like a
something like that. It's got 4 wheels, rolls across the surface, uses the motion sensor in the iPhone to assess the deviation. Carl Perry has been so kind as to send one of those for me to get some data with. So I'm hoping to get some data this year and see what I think of it. But to me, anything that requires a tool is a tool beyond the stimp meter that everybody probably is already using. It's a little bit complicated, which is also why I'm not. I understand the USGA is developing a device that a ball is going to sense this. I haven't seen this. I think it will be really interesting to see the data, but I'm kind of happy with the bauble test because the thing that you're trying to figure out is this green acceptable or not?
Hmm.
Is the condition reaching our standard or not? And it's so easy to do with the bauble test. In your case, you want it to be 8 or above, and it's an 8 is basically very little chatter, very little snaking. So it's almost a perfectly true roll, where there would just be a isolated chatter events, possibly an isolated snaking,
Yep.
and at 9 it's basically indistinguishable from perfect.
Right. Yep.
And so to me, I'm like, what, for research purposes where we're trying to assess something very carefully and put an exact number to it that's been measured, for research purposes, I can understand where we might want something else. But to just simply evaluate a green, I think
Yeah.
it's hard to beat the bauble test.
I think this is a perfect, a great example of the statement that perfect is the enemy of good. In this case, you don't need this data to be perfectly compiled by a machine. A person, a human doing it every day, day after day, will acquire perfectly good usable data for your own golf course, so that you can, yeah, as you said, evaluate how your surfaces are performing. So maybe scroll down, Micah, to the monthly chart. Let's describe this chart here, maybe
Oh,
first.
yeah. So you this chart is showing bauble test across the horizontal x-axis and stimp meter on the y-axis, and so you want this. So this is for the entire year. There were 91 days in which the stimp meter average was greater than or equal to 11 feet, and the bauble test was greater than or equal to 8. So those would be all the points that are in the top right corner with a relatively fast speed and a almost perfectly smooth roll. And
Yep.
then we we broke that down by month, and the next chart that I'll show shows that.
Yep. And so in Minnesota, we can. This is the exact same chart with the plots put into months. So the bobble is across the x-axis and the stimp is on the y-axis. So um, higher up on the chart means faster, and further to the right means smoother. And you can see in Minnesota, we come out of the winter and we apply a fairly heavy top dressing going into winter. So we're dealing with sand on the surface in April, and the grass isn't really growing, so that sand is sort of impacting things. And you can see how that impacts the ball roll and the speed to some degree as well. So April, and then May, you can see there's a little bit of quality coming into May. We also do one of our big top dressing events. One of our planned top dressing events happens in May, so that, as you'll see on the next chart, can impact things. Now we get into June, and now we're starting to really see things get to be pretty consistent. You can see, high up in the right hand corner means the greens are fast and they're very smooth. So in June, mostly up in that top right hand corner, and then in July you can see a really tight pattern, which just means virtually every day the greens were fast and smooth.
Well,
Um,
they in fact they were above 9 on almost every day in July. In June, there's only 2 days I think that didn't
yep,
meet your threshold.
yep, exactly. 2 days in June that didn't meet it. No days in July. And then we get into August, which, as you can see, just kind of turns into a bit of a mess, and I'll explain that. And then September, um, I think is a product. What you see with September there is not too bad, but that's a product of what happened in August. And then I think October is a little bit of a product of what we were doing in both August and September. If you talk about room for growth, so if I'm going to sit down with a green committee and talk about these charts and talk about where we can get better, which I will do, I suspect that August can look much more like June, and September and October can look much more like July. So here's a chart now that shows the entire year of just the bobble test. So that is now on the y-axis going up and down, and then a time scale on the bottom showing the entire golf season from left to right. And each
There's three
day,
lines.
yep, each day of bobble test. So you can see how these lines dip. And Micah created these charts, so many thanks to him for both creating them and allowing me to use them. They're really great. You can see the lines and how we start the season kind of low, and then we work our way up to a real consistent, in the nines, creeping towards higher than 9. I mean, anywhere between 9 and 10 is, you're talking about a near, almost, I would call a perfect green. And then there's a big dip that comes in May, and that, as it's noted, there is a heavy sand top dressing, 8/10 of a millimeter. That
Which
was
is chosen at that time because you expect the grass will have relatively decent growth potential, or
yeah. So that time frame is a little bit of a holdover from when we used to aerify, or had the idea that we were going to aerify twice a year. And this is a good example of how I may look at this and change the way that we're doing our practices. So we talked in the last discussion about the OM246 results prescribing an amount of sand that we want to put down each year. And if I can get to the point where I can put down and get down the amount of sand that I need to get down without doing such a heavy amount in May, I might look at doing that. Because what if? So we see this bobble test score drop when we put that sand down, and then it takes the better part of 2 weeks for it to get back up to where we want it to be, above 9. And what if we eliminated that, or we somehow reduced the amount of top dressing applied at that time, and we could change that from, say, 2 weeks to 7 days, and we get back in there? Or what if we didn't have to apply any of that sand in that period, and instead the line it went up in April, got above 9, and then just stayed above 9 until we did our work in August? That would be, I think, quite appealing to our membership.
that would be.
If we can do that without causing undue harm, then that would be a goal of ours.
That dip that comes just from top dressing, and that was the maximum amount of sand that you could really put and have the canopy keep it.
Yeah, I felt that we did not put any holes. There was no aerification involved in that, so it's just simply sand on the surface. And I felt like at that time of the year, that was the maximum amount of sand I would want to put on without having something to work it into the profile.
And then, so the average bobble test was above 9 going into that top dressing event, which was on May 11th, I think. And then it drops down into the mid 6s initially.
Yep.
And that took until June 1st to get up to 9 again on average. So, yeah, I mean, almost 3 weeks to get back. And what's happening there is that it's because of the sand, but it's also because after you put the sand top dressing, you can't mow and roll as much as you typically would. So it's first the ball's deviating a bit because of the sand itself, but then also there's the lack of maintenance that just can't be done when the greens have sand on them.
Right. And yeah, if you're mowing, you're mowing sand, you're getting, the reels are dull, you're not getting a good cut. There's some period of time there where there's that the lack of maintenance is impacting that as well. And I will say, somebody asked, I don't see it. It's worked its way down, but somebody asked about the type of sand that we use. And I do use a sand that is more consistent with what was in the root zone. So it's a USGA spec top dressing. It's not a it has some bigger pieces in there. And when we work the sand into the holes, I will also use, and before the winter, I'll use the crush component that was a part of that profile. So that does. There's no doubt that that impacts the the way the ball rolls across it. But that's part of getting taking these periods of time and getting the right kind of, in my opinion, getting the right kind of sand on there. So I think we've all maybe heard horror stories of this idea of using an ultra fine sand so that you can get the best possible post top dressing conditions, but then you use this ultra fine sand and then there's some kind of weird layer created on top of um, another layer or on top of the profile that then has to be dealt with by subsequent coring and that sort of thing. So I'm trying to use a sand that matches well with our profile so that as we build this profile larger in time, we're going to have a consistent type of sand. That's the idea behind it. So
John asked a question about data showing layering. I suppose he might be asking about data showing layering because of the infrequent. He said biannual sandings.
yeah.
I think he might also mean not just data, but concern about that layering.
Yeah. I don't have any data. I used to be concerned that that could happen. I'm not anymore. Um, somewhere I posted fairly recently. If you go back through the pictures on Twitter, I think I posted a photo of a plug that came out of one of our greens, and visually there's no layering there, and the performance is good as far as infiltration. Infiltrating the way that we would want it to infiltrate uh, to to perform the way that we need it to, and moisture holding so all of those sort of measures that we would look to see if there's a problem with layering. Don't tell me that there's any problem with layering, but it's something we'll continue to pay attention to for sure.
Yeah, but exactly. That's how I would think of it too. I would always be aware of layering as a potential problem and
Yeah,
watch for it. Then if you see visual, I'm not so concerned with visual layers. Although if I see visual layers, then I'm going to be like, okay, let's also be aware that this could potentially be a problem. But I'm going to be looking at things like water infiltration and root growth, and if the roots don't grow through particular layers, or if water doesn't move through particular layers, then I'm going to realize it's not working, and I'm
sure.
going to have to change it.
Yeah, I would hope that just paying attention visually, we can stay ahead of anything of that nature. But it's certainly something to be aware of, but not concerned with, is the way I would say it.
All right. And then let's keep going through this chart, and then we've got some great questions also in the discussion. So,
So Steve,
you,
I'm going to take a stab at the pronunciation. Nulip. That would it looks like. Is that might be how you pronounce that?
as far as I know, that would be correct.
Yeah.
So,
Again, I would say, he's right in that I'm talking about the type of grasses that I'm dealing with, and I am on the understanding that on ultradwarfs, it may require something else. I mean, I don't have near the experience even looking at ultradwarf grasses that you do, Mike, or other people who might be listening do. But I know that surface is awfully tight, and when I look at them, I think that there's pretty much zero part of the sand that we put down here in Minnesota that would make it into that canopy. So um, that
yeah,
certainly is. I'm not trying to speak with any knowledge of those types of grasses, but again, I would just say that I think the thought exercise that anybody can go through on these sorts of things is good, is worth it. So
yeah, I think that first chart that you showed in this data post, which is you've identified the speed threshold that you'd like to meet on a daily basis
Mm-hmm.
and the smoothness bobble test threshold that you'd like to meet on a daily basis, and you're trying to maximize the number of days in the year in which that is accomplished. Now,
Right.
if that is ninja time every Monday and double verticut every Thursday and top dress every Saturday morning, and that and you do that all year and that produces the results, then that may be a good maintenance approach for a particular facility,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it
I totally agree. If you're doing things that, again, know why you're doing what you're doing, and if what you're doing is producing the results that you want, then I would say you're there's something right there. But at the same time, if you don't if you take something, you could take something out of the equation. Take a ninja time out, see what's happening. It's all observation. But I think we should just know that the practices that we're doing are a part of creating the results that we want to create, rather than just throwing a whole bunch of stuff at the wall and just saying, hey, I'm doing all this stuff, so it's got to all have its place.
Eric's got a question too. I don't I don't know that either of us have an answer to this. Eric was asking if we're seeing a difference in recovery time
Yeah.
using a measure of smoothness like the bobble test between coring and solid tining.
I, I,
I
I don't know that I have an answer to that. Like, I don't know if you do either, but I think the data that we have here on this chart from August can speak to that just a little bit. And
okay.
be a bit of a,
Let's maximize the size of this chart. So there's this big gap that happened because it requires extra focus and extra concentration in order to measure the bobble test at the same time that you're doing the stimpmeter.
yeah,
And as you got into late June, you were 9 or 10 on every roll. So
yeah,
the it was just perfect roll, perfect roll. So you just stopped recording it,
yeah,
and
correct.
and that seems quite reasonable to me because what we're really looking at is for deviations from a perfect roll. So if it's easy to do that because you're not seeing the deviations. So you just say, okay, we're fine. We're not even going to bother recording this data. And that went all the way up until early August.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that chart, it's quite reasonable to say that really from almost June 1st until August 3rd, the bobble test every day was a 9. There are a couple little outliers in there, some 8s, maybe some days we didn't mow, something of that nature. There was a needle tine in there somewhere, if I'm not mistaken. I wish I would have noted that. I didn't. But essentially, for 2 months, we went we had a perfect bobble test of 9, and that's that's a long period of time that our members played on what I would call Ryder Cup like or championship conditions on our greens. That's quite a pleasing thing. Everybody who came out brought a guest. um, Expected something that they saw 2 days ago, got what they expected during that period of time.
And then August happened.
So then, yeah, August happened. So we performed the aerification on August 3rd, and it just we've all had this happen. You do a practice that you think is going to work for what you want to do, and for whatever various reason, it turns out to be the wrong type of process, and that was the case for us. So right after we did it, you can see that the scores. This was holes in the ground, in the green, and then a similar sandy surface left over to what we had in May. So you can see that the bobble test drops in a similar way and sort of starts to almost creep up in a similar way, but then it flattens out and it doesn't plateau, but the curve flattens and doesn't go up as steep. It doesn't return to 9. We went through all of August without having any 9s. We went through almost most of September without any 9s. We finally got back into the 9s when we got to late September, and then that was just for a brief period. Then we went back, and then by that time we're starting to lose a lot of grass growth. The GP has gone down. The grass is not growing like it was, so our maintenance routines are less. October got back up into the nines, but this chart doesn't show it, but the speeds had dropped in October too. So we weren't in that 12.9. We were more like 11.9, which is still plenty good. But um, it, so Eric, to answer Eric's question, I might say that even though that aerification wasn't a coring, it took a long time to heal, like a coring might have taken. And I think that shows, the faster, if you put holes in the ground, the faster that they heal up, and the faster the sand on the surface diminishes, the faster you'll get your bobble test back up to where you want it to be. I would say that sand was the impact of this bobble test until about the third week of August, where you can see it's going up fairly steeply. And then that flattish curve that goes through September to about October 1st was unhealed holes.
And of course you could have dumped fertilizer on it. You could
Right.
have dumped nitrogen fertilizer on it.
Yep.
But the problem with that is you end up creating a whole bunch of organic matter that you then in the future have to come in and punch more holes and
Yes.
add a lot more sand. So it's a
Yep.
vicious cycle. And the more that I measured data about the OM246 test, measuring the total organic material right at the surface of a putting green, and especially looking at how that changes over time, and looking at how much sand people are applying, looking at how much disruption people are doing to greens, and trying to look at how much the grass is actually growing, it seems that the key to this is not so much how much sand we put and how much surface area removal there is with coring. To me, it seems that the key is to minimize the organic matter accumulation rate,
Yeah.
and that's you cannot minimize the accumulation rate when you add more nitrogen fertilizer, and so that is it's a tough one because yeah, I think that if you don't core and don't top dress so much, you don't have to add so much fertilizer. That's something I'm gonna make a lot of calculations about this year and try to explain just how big of an effect I think this really has. That is also, I think, kind of under it's outside people's thoughts and field of vision right now, because it's so customary to apply in American units like 3 or 4 pounds of nitrogen to putting greens, and in international units that would be like 150 to 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, which in some parts of the world that would be a substantial amount. In others, it would be a lot. But something that I've seen as I've gone all over the world and again been influenced quite a bit by the way that bentgrass greens are managed in Japan is seeing how low those are. I had a blog post last week that was looking at data from 2015 in Japan, and a whole bunch of courses across the country reported how much nitrogen they applied. They'd applied the median value for those bentgrass greens was like 11.2 grams, which would be 112 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, which is about 2.1 pounds or 2.2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. So when you are doing that amount of nitrogen supply, that used to seem incredibly low to me. It used to seem so low to only apply that much for a place like Japan that has quite a long growing season. But when you do that, when you create that type of growth rate, that the type of growth rate that happens when you're only applying 100, let's say 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, you don't have to do so much disruption. The organic matter accumulation rate is relatively low. You don't have to put so much sand. But once you start putting sand and putting coring, and doing coring, then you have to have a faster growth rate in order to recover. So it's hard to separate where the cause and where the effect is. There's one question that I can answer here. Dr. Daniel Hahn has joined and said, have you used something like the perimeter to measure smoothness rather than the holing out test or the bobble test? And he said, sorry if I missed it. He just tuned in. Daniel, uh, I
Sorry,
did.
duty called. Um,
Yes, that's
yep.
fine, Chris. So I'm just going to finish answering a question
Okay.
about the perimeter, and then we'll be back to your insight. So I I've seen the perimeter in action. I've used it a few times, but I've never had one until this year. Carl Perry was kind enough to send one from which I will be able to get some data. So I'm going to take a closer look at it. I do think though, I mean it's a brilliant idea to have a simple rolling device that can have an iPhone in it that a lot of people have, or you can get a dedicated iPhone to use in this perimeter, and then you use the motion sensor as that carefully calibrated device goes across the surface to measure what the vertical and lateral deviation is of the ball that's embedded in that or attached to those four wheels as it goes across the surface. It's a great idea. It's very sensitive. It's also an extra tool to carry around, and it's something that Chris said it's like perfect is the enemy of the good. I'm quite satisfied with what the bobble test tells us, because the bobble test tells us we're looking for, if is the ball bouncing, does it leave the ground, does it bounce but not leave the ground, and does it deviate to the left or to the right, which is called snaking. So you're looking at it with your eyes, which is the same thing that the golfers are doing. And it turns out to be quite an accurate assessment of that. So I like the bobble test because it's so easy. Anybody can do it. And you don't have to have a special device for it. Now, for research purposes, I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that there could be quite a bit of value in having devices that measure something precisely. All right, Chris,
Um,
where were we?
yeah. So if we look at that, what we had in August, the bubble test, and getting back to the very beginning of this discussion and the photos of is this disruption or is this disruption, and how we think about it as a turf manager and how our golfers will think about it. I think that August is a good example that what the visual of the surface looks like is important to our golfers. So even though in August you can see that uh, within a pretty short period of time, we were back to a bobble test above 8, which is our threshold that we want to meet, and that continued to rise. The speed, I don't remember how the speed correlated during those periods, but I think the speed was okay, probably close to or above 11, which is again above our threshold. But that whole period, really almost until October 1st, our members were just not happy with the surfaces, despite the fact that the data was telling me that they were rolling fine, the speed and the smoothness was good. But they
Yeah,
weren't happy because they looked like they had been disrupted. They were noticeably disrupted visually, and that is an important aspect in how they feel about the golf course, whether we believe that or not.
yeah, it's tough when there's holes. If you can visually see something, and I've let's see, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, but I see that you've said coming up post 4, the paradox of progress. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, but I'm certainly looking forward to reading that. So um, as we've talked about this, kind of what you talked about in the second blog post too, about maybe the members are right.
Mm-hmm.
I've thought about situations where I've traveled to other parts of the world, uh, and I use this the example going to Royal Melbourne in Australia. And if I if I traveled all the way to Royal Melbourne, or if I traveled all the way to St Andrews in Scotland, and I was going to play the old course, my maybe if this is my first time to be there, I've probably read some books about this or watched some tournament highlights from this, or looked at various course reviews on Golf Club Atlas or other places. I would have studied it to see what is so great about this golf course that I'm going to see, and to make sure that I get all the best of my time when I'm there. And as a golfer, if I went to Royal Melbourne and if I saw visible holes on the green and if I had to putt through a bit of sand, I would feel like I wasn't getting the full experience that I'd traveled all the way to Melbourne to experience. And the same thing anywhere, I think. And that's
Right.
probably pretty typical for a golfer's perspective. And so as a golf course superintendent, if you're able to avoid that as much as possible, that seems like it would be quite advantageous. But as you're probably going to talk about in post 4, the paradox of progress, maybe we have so many professors or teachers like me, certainly in the past, that tell us that all this stuff is essential. And we have so much technology in terms of the machinery that can do
Yep.
this so efficiently and so well, and so
Yep.
many options,
Yep.
that maybe we're a little bit blind to that simple thing that golfers want perfect greens all the time.
Yep. I think you have, when I wrote that line previewing the fourth post, I was hoping that that would be what people would anticipate about that post, because that is kind of what I'm gonna try to get into, is this idea that uh, we've we've been almost blinded by progress. And as superintendents and as turf managers, we always think, everything is about progressing, everything is about raising the bar to the another level, and then that becomes the bar becomes the floor, and then we got to raise the bar to the next level. And we do that in lots of different ways. I think in many ways we do that by you know improving the technology, improving the means in which we do things, um, and the simplicity in which we can do things. As you said, Micah, equipment. I mean, top dressing equipment today versus what it used to be is amazing. And when we have these things, we sell to our members. Well, this is why we need to get it. This is what we need to do with it. Um, you know, all these various things, and we do them because we see other people doing them, and we think, well, if it's been created and it's been invented and it's here, then if we use it, it must make things better. And I think we think that this is progress, and I think it has blinded us a little bit into, well, what is the real point of what we're doing, which is to create a great playing surface that people can play on and enjoy, um, for the maximum number of days during the course of a golf season.
It's yeah, it's an interesting way to think of it that I guess is a little bit outside the mainstream, because I see certainly, I guess in American turfgrass education, if we go to turf school, of course we get taught that we're going to be maintaining a football field or a golf course, and it's going to be a playing surface. But really, we're in the ag department of a university, and we're getting taught about plants and about soils in a very agriculturally, that's what the viewpoint is coming from, and we're talking about how to have healthy plants and that sort of thing. And so as we progress through our careers, there's a lot of focus about having healthier grass, more stress tolerant grass, all of these things that are about having better grass,
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes actually does come at the expense of playing surfaces.
Yeah.
And it's if we just forget about the roots and forget about the how stress tolerant the grass is and forget about how healthy the grass is, and just say, okay, let's keep 100% grass cover. I'm a huge advocate of having 100% grass cover on greens. That's my number one criterion when I evaluate a putting green. is there 100% grass cover? That's the starting point. And if we have 100% grass cover, it's a lot easier to work towards the playability that we're trying to achieve, which is quite hard if you don't have 100% grass cover. But I'm always starting with trying to fix that situation.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because there may be another post that comes down the road asking about is this disruption, and it may be along those lines. And again, I always use my own photos, so um, I won't use anything from somebody else. But that's on my mind to be part of this whole thing.
Cool. Let's do a couple more of these comments. YouTuber 49 has solid tined and hollow tined in Washington one fall. Solid tine healed and closed much quicker, 9 days versus 2.5 weeks. Yep, that would be about typical, I think. So it would be expected that solid tine would be faster recovery.
Couple comments. Yeah.
Eric hasn't done bobble data on Poa annua yet. What do you think, Eric? Do you think are you intrigued by this and you think it might be useful?
Yeah, I really can't. I've yet to. I carefully evaluate before I decide to take some piece of measurement, take some measurement and record it as data. Did I say that right? I used the right.
I think so.
Okay. I evaluate it pretty carefully. Oftentimes, you and I'll have a discussion about whether that's valuable. I don't want to waste my time recording anything that I think isn't going to really make a difference and be valuable. So everything that we do is I've found to be valuable, and I have really found this bobble test to be a valuable piece of information, especially when coupled with the stimp meter, and you can take the two. It literally adds almost no time to my collection of data in the morning,
Yeah,
because you're doing it at the same time.
my history with this is like most things. I'm kind of resistant to it because I don't like doing extra work and extra data collection. And I just kind of assumed that for most places, just the stimp meter is sufficient. Because I guess I thought people were evaluating how the ball's rolling and not just looking only at the speed. But in some measurements in Thailand, the average green speed in Thailand is about 9.5 feet. So it's pretty fast when you measure something that's 10.5 feet. And I was measuring it one of the top courses in Thailand, and the speed was over 10 feet. So the green speed was pretty fast. And the professional there was telling me that, yeah, the greens weren't, he's like, it's rolling okay, but there's something wrong with the roll. And I was doing the bobble test and getting 5 and 6s because sometimes the ball was bouncing. It was still going fast. I mean, by Thailand standards, it was 10.5 feet. That, and the greens are sloping. That's pretty fast for me. And yet the ball was snaking all over the place, chattering through the roll, and it was a 5 or 6 on the bobble test. And I guess I had thought that when the ball was rolling like that, people were like golf course superintendents were noticing that and were doing things to strive to make it smoother.
Yep.
But I realized that maybe there was a gap, and so I'm begrudging. Uh, well, I just decided, yeah, maybe this is a measurement that I'm going to have to start adding or start recommending that more people do.
Well, I think that's a good point. And again, I don't have this information. I haven't done a bobble test over turf that's been verticut, but I suspect for some amount of time, depending upon how aggressive that is, probably, and maybe there's an amount that can be done that makes it less impactful. But I suspect that for some amount of time after that's done, that ball is going to be affected, and the way that it rolls is going to be affected by that that verticutting. Um, we do occasionally brush our greens, so it would be good to get some data and make some notes of after maybe a brushing event, a brooming event, what happens to that bobble test. I suspect there'll be a negative impact. I think anytime anything that hits the surface um, outside of a roll or a mow um, is going to have a negative impact. I actually remember the week of the Ryder Cup, Kim Sintorn from the Swedish Golf Federation had a perimeter here, and he had asked me if it would be okay if he took those readings. And he wasn't, we weren't downloading that data and debriefing on it each day. He said, I'm not going to bother you with this. I just want to have it for my own information. But he said, if you're interested, I'll share it with you before we leave. And he did. And it was really what I thought was somewhat interesting. And again, very small sample size. So you can't say that this is necessarily true in all cases. But during the events, Friday and Saturday during the event, we had not rolled. We had only mowed. We were getting the speeds that we wanted just from mowing. We didn't want to overdo it. And the data that Kim got then on Sunday morning when we mowed and rolled for the first time, the greens were not as smooth as they were on Friday and Saturday. Now, is that perceptible by the players? I doubt it. But I think it's an example of how the more you do on the surface, there's a threshold. To some extent, you need to run something over that surface to smooth it out. But there's probably a point at which you've now run too much over that surface and you're not smoothing it. You're not making it any smoother. It's just a small, very small sample size example that I think maybe highlights that point.
Have you gotten much feedback from the blog posts? I think there's 3 of them posted now. Have
Yeah.
people emailed and said, "Wow, this is a revelation," or have they?
Yeah. I haven't gotten anything directly like that. I'm, just some minor comments on Twitter, just saying, this is really good stuff, very interesting. But it does seem like the people who are reading it are find it interesting, and it's sparking some thought. And I would expect that to be the case. If somebody doesn't agree with me, they're probably not going to bother reading that. I would hope that they would, because that's the way that I think we improve our thinking and our thought process, is by reading stuff that is counter to what we are doing. But there's a little bit of I suppose bias on this. People who are kind of into this or interested in this are the people who are going to be reading it too. But the feedback is the kind of minor feedback has been good. I think people find it interesting. So that's good. I hope that's what I wanted.
When you took your brief break a few moments ago, I was talking about the accumulation rate of organic matter and the nitrogen application rate, which really controls the growth, which will control the organic matter accumulation rate, and then the the need or the demand for sand top dressing, and the need and the demand for verticutting, and the need and the demand for removal of organic matter through coring, and the need to inject sand into the root zone is really linked to that. And I'm not sure that as an industry that we quite realize how much those are linked. And if you which is why I think measuring the performance of the surface as a playing surface is so valuable, because if you put 0 nitrogen, the grass will die, but you probably don't need to top dress it either. Like
Right.
So if we want to create a surface that requires no verticutting, no top dressing, and no coring, we could just apply no fertilizer, no water, and it won't grow. And then that surface doesn't require any of those practices.
Yep.
That's where clipping volume can be useful too, to kind of see where you're at in terms of how much the grass is growing.
Right.
But trying to
Yep.
put all these pieces together, and I'm not saying like collect data just for the sake of doing it, but if we're trying to maximize the number of days in the year with the if we're trying to have the most days in the year with the best playing conditions, we need to disrupt the surface as little as possible. That
Yep.
seems obvious. The
Yep.
question is, what is, for any facility, what is the minimum disruption required? Because
Hmm.
at some point, if you just let grass grow and you don't ever put sand, that especially over the top of a sand root zone, the
Yep.
expectation is that it's going to turn into a spongy like surface at some point.
Yep.
So by measuring some of these key data points and especially looking at the playability, I think you can get closer and closer year after year to achieving that. That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's kind of exciting, the potential.
Well, it's. I think it's really. I mean, of course, I'm sort of in the middle of this, and I'm finding how what the attitude of our members has been by just having a stretch of, you know, 2 months of not undisrupted surfaces, and I know how they react to that, and I know how much they love it. But I would think if I was managing a golf course, that it would be exciting to think that there are ways that we can probably increase the number of days of which our golfers are going to be extremely satisfied with the product, as opposed to sort of, I'm going to do all this maintenance. Here's my maintenance schedule, and the result of it will be some number of perfect days, some other number of medium days, and then some number of days in which there's some, you know, level of disruption. Um, yeah, I think we have to do some things. I think we all know that, and I'm not saying this is, you know, zero, or it's all or nothing. That's not it at all. But I think it can be much more. We can tune the things that we need to do to the course in a way that will also actually make our members much more happy, as opposed to saying to them, well, we're just making it better for tomorrow. You know, maybe in those two periods of May and August, I can say to them, I'm doing this so that we can then go into a stretch of 60 or 70 days straight of perfect greens. And then in August, I can come back and say, okay, I'm going to do this, but then following a 7-day break, we're going to have another 45 days of perfect greens before the end of the season. Or it would be more than that, 60, 70 days. So, you know, I think that should be appealing to just about anybody.
It Yeah, it certainly makes sense to me. I think it makes sense to you, and it just requires not doing things in the textbook way.
Mm-hmm.
And because if we say the textbook way, it's like all these things that are supposed to be essential, and instead just looking at what works best for your facility, which I think everybody's doing what they think is best for their facility, but actually measuring that, it can be a bit of a revelation.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
I
Yeah.
like
I don't think anyone does any of these things with the intent of irritating golfers. There's absolutely no doubt that's nobody's doing that. But that doesn't mean it isn't causing them some irritation, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't, you know, open our ears to what they're saying about what we're doing.
because I I had always been an advocate for doing more of these things because
Mm-hmm.
I, especially in a challenging climate, where everywhere has stressful times of year at some time of year. So I always wanted the grass to be as healthy as possible going into those stress periods to make sure that we maintain 100% grass cover, which is my number one criterion for evaluating the quality of a green. Is so I was always focused on the grass health aspect of it and having healthier grass and thinking that a lot of this stuff was essential. And then at various times over the past 15 years, I've noticed that a lot of places are not doing as much of that disruptive work as I thought was necessary. There's sometimes not punching a single hole year after year after year,
Mhm.
sometimes top dressing only once or twice a year and not punching any holes. And the surfaces just got better and better. And I had some data to show that and my own observations and photos and so on, the conditions just kept getting better and better. And it's like, I can't keep making these recommendations of doing it the textbook way
Right.
when there are these isolated cases that I'm aware of people not doing it the textbook way and getting great results. And now what you're doing is, like, I think top dressing only a few times a year is probably non-textbook. Obviously, there's other places doing that, but most places are probably top dressing more than 3 times a year. And so, doing this, how can you do it safely and not be thinking that you're putting the grass at risk or putting your job at risk or putting the members' satisfaction of playing on good 100% grass cover greens at risk? And I think what you're describing in this series of blog posts seems to be a way that could be applied anywhere to figure this out for your facility to maybe safely move in the direction of optimizing conditions with minimal disturbance, if that's something that one wanted to
Yeah.
pursue.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think that would be probably most people's biggest concern, is that they're going to do some kind of undue harm, and they're going to, okay, I do this for 2 or 3 years, and then after 2 or 3 years, we're in a position where, oh my gosh, I've got some kind of um, major problem. One, I don't think that that's going to happen, because I think you're going to see some kind of decline in the the numbers that you're taking, and some kind of decline in performance well before that becomes a major issue that you then have to try to um, do some kind of major work to resolve. And two, one is good enough. I don't know what two was going to be, so I thought there'd be two, but one, I think, is it. I just think I think this is a worthy endeavor, and I think if you're keeping track of what you're doing on both ends, on the short term and the long term, I think you're not going to run into problems.
Yeah.
Here's a good question. Jason Haynes says he aerifies only to irritate golfers. That doesn't surprise me. Um,
So
that's nothing less. And
are
then
you
I like this one. How do old cultivars versus modern ones factor into the discussion? I have old Pencross. That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. When I was at Northland, previous to Hazeltine, I wasn't necessarily thinking about turf management in this way. Our greens, the bent grass we did have, I would say they were old cultivars, mostly, I think, bent grass. And so I know what that's like. It's kind of laying down a little bit, but that can still produce a pretty great surface. I don't know the answer. I think you'd have to start doing this, collecting your own data on it, and then find out what is going to be best for those old cultivars. I might guess, a guess I would have is that if you do something to the surface of let's say a Pencross green, like a verticut or even a brooming or something of that nature, I might guess that the impact on the ball roll is going to be more, simply because of the way that is more of a leafy type of surface, laying down a little bit more, producing a little bit more grain. But that's total speculation.
all right? We're coming up on 2 hours of this, and we've gone through all the blog posts. I've asked all the questions that I had. I will ask anybody watching it live now, if you want to ask us any questions, please put those in the chat, and we will we will address those. Otherwise, Chris, what? So you can't keep doing this indefinitely. So there must be a plan for a few more posts, uh, and then you'll be
Well,
back to work in a long hiatus from blogging.
probably, yeah, probably. That's the nice thing about winter is it provides this opportunity for thinking and these long sort of drawn out thought processes that manifest themselves as these blog posts. Um, I'm not quite the I don't have quite the time on my hands that I used to have back in the Northland days, as we discussed early on in this chat. So I don't find myself doing much blogging during the course of the season. Um, so I think we're coming up on March, and I suspect there's going to be probably two more, maybe three more posts in this series, and I'll wrap those up, and then yeah, we'll start to get towards maintaining the golf course and seeing if those numbers that we looked at today on the data post can improve next year. I think that will be the goal. That will be the progress that I'm looking to make in 2022 is to push those numbers into even more consistency than what we have in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, and I always wonder because this kind of goes against the way that I used to manage when I was a superintendent, which was much more disruptive and much more nitrogen and a much more rapid growth rate. And it's quite different than the way I used to recommend people manage. It's different than what we read about in the textbooks generally. So I'm I'm always quite pleased when I see that the results come out as good as they do. And I'd be interested if other people try this and get good results. I hope that they will share it. And if people get bad results, that's even more important to share of just like this is, you know, if I don't top dress my ultra dwarf greens on a weekly basis, for
Yeah,
example, they fail and get more disease after 3 months. It's
yeah,
good to know that because what we're talking about is what works at Pen A, what's working on USGA sand root zone Pen A4 greens in the Minneapolis type of climate,
yeah,
and we're trying to describe a framework, I think, of what might be measured in
yeah.
order to do this, but it's not actually something of how you would manage in Miami or Bogota or something.
Right. I mean, I think I think it could be a framework of thought as to how might I, um, implement some of this or these ideas or this thinking at my own course, whatever, whether I have POA in the Northwest or POA in the Northeast or, yeah, Ultradorf Bermuda in Southern Florida, um, or any other part of the world. But hopefully it stimulates some critical thinking, I guess, in people.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for joining me, and thank you for doing these blog posts for writing them. I am just I find it fascinating this topic, and I really am so glad that you wrote about it. We've got one more question just come up. Just when
the
I turn on the
commentary.
music to close
Yeah,
this thing out.
exactly.
Yeah, so Matt just recently became head greenkeeper, and there were some disease scars, which he treats differently to the rest. So he's solid tining every 4 weeks and top dressing. Yeah, I mean, I think when you need a more rapid growth rate, that's a good opportunity to do that kind of work.
Yep. Yeah, and hopefully if you adjust what you're doing on those greens, you get that full cover that we were talking about. Hopefully eventually you get to a point where you are managing the greens. You can manage them all the same, and that's ultimately the goal. But I think you need to be willing to adjust and do things a little bit differently if you're treating a green differently.
Jason Chenault, I believe, is in Phnom Penh, Cambodia this evening.
Where
And
is Jason? That's kind of he's
I
yeah.
I think he's in Cambodia, and he he went ahead and admitted that that was him, the LinkedIn user. So, Jason, thank you so much for joining. It's awesome to have you back in this part of the world, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon too.
Yeah, thanks for the comments, Jason. That's very kind.
So, yeah, I think thanks everyone for joining. I'll do another office hour sometime, and Chris will do his blog posts, and we can keep this discussion going. And yeah, maybe the end of this season we can duplicate those charts and see what they look like this year. I think that's when it really gets interesting.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
hopefully it's good. All right, Chris. Well, thank you for joining. Thanks everybody for joining this live. And if you're listening to it later or watching this later, I hope you found it useful. And we will, yeah, just keep trying to share good information and have fun with turfgrass management and do it as good as we can.
Yep. Well, thank you for inviting me to the office hours, Mike. I'm glad to be here again for a second chat, and it's always enjoyable.
Thank you. All right, everyone, wherever you are in the world, thanks for joining. Good morning, good night, and goodbye.